In the waning days of the Third Age, when the shadow of Mordor had at last been lifted from Middle-earth, there came to Minas Tirith a messenger bearing the seal of Elrond half-elven. The rider, clad in the grey of Rivendell, sought audience with King Elisar, for tidings most dire had reached the hidden valley. Aragorn received the message in his private chamber, the weight of kingship heavy upon his brow. The parchment bore words that chilled his heart. The dying Vale stirs once more. The ancient evil that sleeps beneath the misty mountains has begun to wake. Come swiftly, for time grows short. Within the fortnight, a small company departed Minas Tirith. Alongside the king rode Gimli the dwarf, whose axe had tasted the blood of orcs in countless battles, and Legolas of the woodland realm, whose keen eyes could pierce the darkest shadows. With them came Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, and 20 of Gondor's finest rangers. The journey north took them through the Rohirrim's land, where Éomer King granted them swift horses and provision. As they crossed the gap between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, an unnatural mist began to gather, and the very air seemed to whisper with voices long dead. Rivendell greeted them with its timeless beauty, yet even here shadows seemed longer, and the very stone appeared troubled. Elrond met them at the bridge, his ageless face marked with concern, deeper than any Aragorn had seen since the days of the War of the Ring. "My friends," spoke the Lord of Rivendell, "grave tidings have come to me from lands forgotten by most. The dying Vale, which lies in the deepest parts of the Misty Mountains beyond the High Pass, has awakened from its slumber. There dwells an evil older than Sauron, older even than Morgoth's first treachery. In the Hall of Fire, maps were spread before the council. Ancient charts showed a hidden valley, sealed by the Valar themselves in the Elder Days. Elrond's finger traced the location, far beyond the paths known to men or even elves. What evil could be greater than the Dark Lord himself? Asked Gimli, his hand resting upon his axe handle. Elrond's eyes grew distant. In the beginning, before the music of creation was complete, there were discordant notes, things that should never have been given form. One such entity was bound in the dying Vale, and the seals that hold it weaken with each passing age. Already, our scouts report strange lights in the mountains and beasts fleeing southward in terror. The company departed Rivendell ere the dawn, following paths known only to the elves. Elladan and Elrohir, sons of Elrond, served as guides, their faces grim with purpose. The way led them through the Trollshaws and up into the High Pass, but then diverged onto paths unmarked by any map of men. As they climbed higher, the very mountains seemed to rebel against their presence. Stones fell without cause, winds howled from clear skies, and at night they heard singing in languages that predated the awakening of the elves. Legolas alone could understand fragments. Laments for a world unmade, songs of entropy and ending. On the fifth day, they reached the threshold of sorrows, a narrow defile carved with runes of binding. The symbols pulsed with a sickly light, and where they touched the stone, the rock itself appeared to weep. Here, Elladan spoke words of power that caused the very air to shimmer, revealing a passage that led downward into the heart of the mountain. "Beyond this point," warned Elrohir, "we enter the dying Vale proper. What we seek lies at its heart, the sepulchre of whispers, where the unnamed sleeps. But beware, the Vale itself is alive with malice, and it knows we come." The passage wound downward for leagues, lit by phosphorescent fungi that cast an eerie glow upon walls carved with scenes of primordial chaos. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of copper and decay. Their torches flickered and died, as if the very darkness here devoured light itself. It was Gimli who first noticed the statues. Carved from some black stone that seemed to absorb their fading light, they depicted warriors in armor of no earthly design. As the company passed, the dwarf could have sworn he saw the stone figures turn their heads to follow their movement. "These are the Watchers of the First Deep," whispered Elladan, elves who volunteered to become eternal guardians, binding their spirits to stone to prevent the unnamed from breaking free. They yet served their vigil, though it has driven them beyond sanity. Suddenly, the passage opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow. Before them stretched the dying Vale, not a valley of earth and stone, but a realm where reality itself seemed wounded. Trees of silver and gold grew downward from the cavern roof, their roots reaching toward a crimson lake that reflected no light. And in that lake, barely visible beneath its surface, something vast, terrible stirred. Upon the shores of the crimson lake stood ruins that defied comprehension, spires twisted into impossible shapes, bridges that connected to empty air, and towers that cast shadows despite the absence of any sun. This was Thuringwethil, the city of echoes, built by the unnamed servants in mockery of the great cities of the elves. As they drew near, the ruins seemed to shimmer and shift. Streets appeared where none had been moments before, leading to destinations that could not exist. From the twisted spires came sound, not quite music, not quite screaming, that spoke of minds driven beyond the borders of sanity. "The city remembered," said Legolas, his usually steady voice trembling. "It remembers every soul that was devoured here, every scream, every moment of despair. They echo still, trapped within these stones." Faramir drew his sword, though its blade seemed dim in this accursed place. "What manner of creatures built such an abomination?" "Not creature," replied Elrohir. "The unnamed thoughts given form. When it dreams, its nightmares take shape in stone and shadow. When it stirs in its slumber, the city rebuilds itself, always more terrible than before." They pressed forward through streets that whispered with the voices of the lost, past doorways that led to rooms filled with starlight or screaming void. At the city's heart stood a palace of black glass, and within its depths they could hear it, the slow, rhythmic breathing of something that should not be. The palace doors stood 20 feet tall, carved from a single piece of obsidian. Upon their surface writhed figures in eternal torment, not carved but somehow imprisoned within the stone itself. As Aragorn approached, the figures turned their tiny, anguished faces toward him, their mouths moving in silent pleas for release. Beyond the doors lay the sepulchre of whisper. The chamber was vast beyond measure, its walls covered in mirrors of polished silver that reflected not the company, but visions of what had been and what might yet come to pass. In some mirrors, they saw Middle-earth as it was, green and fair. In others, they beheld a world consumed by shadow, where nothing lived save the servants of the unnamed. At the chamber's center lay a pool of liquid darkness, perfectly circular and utterly still. From its depths rose a dais of white bone, and upon that dais rested a sarcophagus of crystal. Within the crystal, clearly visible yet somehow indefinite, lay the unnamed, a form that was simultaneously beautiful and hideous, familiar and alien, terrible and pitiful. "Behold," whispered Elladan, "the unbegotten one, the note that should never have sounded in the great music, even in sleep. Its dreams poison the world." As they stood before the sarcophagus, cracks began to appear in the crystal. A sound like breaking glass echoed through the chamber, and the mirrors upon the walls began to shatter, one by one. The liquid darkness of the pool began to churn, and from its depths emerged shapes that hurt the eye to look upon, servants of the unnamed, beings that existed in too many dimensions for mortal sight to comprehend. "It wakes!" cried Gimli, raising his axe. "The seals fail!" The battle that followed was unlike any they had fought before. The servants of the unnamed did not attack with sword or claw, but with nightmare and madness. They whispered lies that felt like truth, showed visions that broke the heart, and sang songs that unraveled the very fabric of identity. Legolas loosed arrow after arrow, each shaft blazing with the light of Valinor. Yet for every servant that fell, two more emerged from the churning darkness. Faramir's blade, blessed by the Palantir of Minas Tirith, cut through shadow and dream alike, but his strength waned with each passing moment. It was then that Aragorn understood. This was not a battle to be won with sword or bow, but with will itself, Drawing Anduril, he strode toward the crystal sarcophagus, even as the Unnamed's eyes began to open within their prison of crystal and dream. The eyes of the Unnamed were like twin voids, darker than the space between stars. As they opened fully, reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the sarcophagus. The very air became thick as honey, and each step toward the crystal prison required tremendous effort. "You come at last, heir of Isildur," spoke a voice that was not heard but felt, like cold fingers tracing the spine. "Long have I dreamed of this moment. Long have I waited for one worthy to bear my gifts." Aragorn pressed forward, Anduril blazing with the light of the two trees. But with each step, visions assaulted his mind. Arwen lying cold in Rivendell, Gondor burning beneath a starless sky, his friends twisted into creatures of shadow and malice. "You see truly," the voice whispered. "This is the fate that awaits all things, entropy and ending, decay and death. I offer you something greater, the power to unmake suffering by unmaking existence itself. Is this not mercy?" Behind him, his companions fought desperately against the servants of the Unnamed. Gimli's axe had grown heavy in his hands, and Legolas's arrows flew wide of their marks. The very air they breathed was becoming poison, and the mirror visions showed only defeat and despair. "Look upon your friends," the Unnamed continued. "See how they suffer. See how they die. All of this can end. All of this pain and struggle and futile hope. I can silence it forever. All you need do is break these bonds, and I shall grant the mercy of non-existence to all creation." As despair threatened to overwhelm the company, a new voice joined the cacophony of whispers and screams. Clear and strong, it rose above the chaos. Elladan had begun to sing, not in Westron or Sindarin, but in the pure tongue of Valinor, words that had been sung at the very beginning of the world. The song told of the great music, of how Ilúvatar had taken even the discord of Melkor and woven it into a greater harmony. It spoke of the beauty that could emerge from struggle, of the light that shone brightest in the deepest darkness. And as he sang, Elrohir joined his voice to his brothers, their words becoming a bulwark against the whispers of the Unnamed. The effect was immediate. The servants of Shadow recoiled from the song as if burned by fire, and the visions in the mirrors began to change. Instead of showing only endings, they revealed new beginnings. Forests growing from the ashes of war, children playing where once armies had marched, hope kindled in the darkest of hearts. "No," hissed the Unnamed, its voice losing some of its terrible certainty. "You cannot undo what has been set in motion. The music is broken. The world is wounded beyond repair." But Aragorn had found his strength renewed. The song of the Sons of Elrond reminded him of his purpose, not to end suffering by ending existence, but to guard what was good and beautiful in the world. With a cry that echoed through the sepulchre, he brought Andúril down upon the crystal sarcophagus. The Blade of Kings struck the crystal prison, and the sound that followed was like the breaking of the world. Cracks spread outward from the point of impact, each one blazing with silver light. The Unnamed screamed, not with voice, but with a sound that existed beyond hearing, a cry that made the very foundations of the mountain tremble. But something was wrong. Instead of being destroyed, the Unnamed began to pour through the cracks like liquid shadow, its form becoming more substantial with each passing moment. The crystal had not been a prison, but a chrysalis, and Aragorn had freed the very thing he sought to stop. "You have done well, King of Gondor," laughed the Unnamed as it rose from the shattered remains of its crystal shell. Its form was terrible to behold, simultaneously beautiful and hideous, shifting between shapes that no mortal mind could fully grasp. "You have freed me at last from my centuries of dreaming. Now, the real work can begin." The company fought with desperate courage, but their weapons passed through the Unnamed like shadows through light. It was incorporeal, yet undeniably present, a walking negation of all that was good and true in the world. Where its feet touched the ground, the stone crumbled to dust. Where its breath fell, the very air became poison. "Did you truly think your little song could bind me?" the unnamed mocked. "I am beyond your music, beyond your light, beyond your hope. I am the silence between the notes, the darkness between the stars. I am what remains when all else is gone." As the unnamed stepped forth from its sepulchre, the very chamber began to collapse. The mirrors shattered in sequence, each one releasing the trapped visions within, scenes of joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, all the myriad possibilities of existence flowing together in a chaotic torrent. But in that chaos, Faramir glimpsed something that made his heart leap with sudden understanding. In one of the mirrors, he had seen himself as an old man, telling stories to grandchildren he had not yet fathered. In another, he witnessed Eowyn as she would be, crowned Queen of Rohan, her face radiant with joy and purpose. "The mirrors," he shouted above the chaos, "they're not showing possibilities, they're showing what must be. The unnamed isn't destroying the future. It's trying to escape from one it cannot control." The truth struck Aragorn like a physical blow. The unnamed was not a god of destruction, but a prisoner of its own nature, a being that existed outside the music of creation, and therefore outside fate itself. It could see all possible futures, but it could not choose among them. Every decision paralyzed it with infinite alternative. Every action spawned countless consequences it could not predict or control. "That's why it wants to end everything," breathed Legolas. "It cannot bear the weight of infinite possibility." The unnamed had heard their word, and for the first time, something like vulnerability crossed its terrible feature. "You understand nothing," it snarled, but the conviction was gone from its voice. "To see all ending, to know every path that leads to sorrow. This is not power, but torment beyond measure." In that moment of understanding, Aragorn made a choice that would echo through the ages. Instead of striking again with Anduril, he sheathed his blade and stepped forward, arms open and defenseless. "Then let us help you bear that burden," he said simply. The unnamed recoiled as if struck. "What trickery is this? You would offer mercy to one who would unmake your world?" "I offer what was offered to me," Aragorn replied. "Hope when hope seemed lost. A path forward when all paths seemed dark. You are not evil by choice, but by nature, and nature can be changed." Elladan and Elrohir began to sing again, but this time their song was different. Instead of the pure harmonies of Valinor, they wove a new melody, one that included discord and darkness, but transformed them into something greater. They sang of redemption, second chances, of how even the most broken things could be made beautiful again. The unnamed's form began to waver, its terrible certainty cracking like ice in spring. But the future, the endless, terrible futures, need not be faced alone, said Gimli gruffly, stepping up beside his king. "That's what friends are for, isn't it?" And so it was that in the depths of the dying vale, the unnamed was offered the one thing it had never received: companionship in its vigil over infinite possibility. The sons of Elrond wove about it bonds not of crystal and stone, but of friendship and understanding. The entity that had once threatened to unmake the world became its guardian, watching over the paths of possibility to ensure that hope would always triumph over despair. The dying vale became the living vale, its crimson lake clearing to reflect not shadows, but starlight. The city of echoes transformed into a place of memory and healing, where the voices of the past could find peace at last. And in the years that followed, when darkness threatened Middle-earth and the future seemed uncertain, there would sometimes come aid from an unexpected source. Dreams of guidance, whispers of warning, echoes of hope from the deepest places of the world. For the unnamed had learned at last the secret of the great music, that even discord could find its place in the greater harmony, and that the most broken voices could sing the sweetest songs of all. Thus ended the tale of the echoes in the dying vale, though its echoes would resonate through Middle-earth for ages yet to come. Epilogue. The song eternal 20 years. Hence, the great doors of Minas Tirith stood open to the autumn wind, and King Elisar gazed eastward from his tower, his weathered hands resting upon the stone parapet. 20 years had passed since the company had descended into the dying Vale, and Middle-earth bore the subtle marks of that transformation in ways both seen and unseen. Arwen approached from behind, her footsteps silent upon the marble floor. Though she bore the grace of the Eldar still, there was something new in her bearing, a depth of understanding that came from sharing in the burden her husband had carried since that day beneath the mountains. "The dreams have come again," she said, not as a question, but as gentle observation. Aragorn nodded slowly. "Each night now, as the anniversary approaches. But they are different this time, beloved. Not visions of warning or guidance, but something else entirely. Memories that are not mine. Songs in languages that predate even the awakening of the firstborn. The unnamed shares its vigil with you still," Arwen murmured, moving to stand beside him at the parapet. "As it has since that day, you chose mercy over conquest." Below them, the city of Gondor stretched in all directions, more prosperous than it had been in centuries. The white stone gleamed in the afternoon light, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the courtyard gardens. But Aragorn's eyes were drawn beyond the walls, toward the distant peaks of the misty mountains, where shadows gathered, despite the clear sky. "It grows stronger," he said quietly, "the bond between us. Sometimes I fear that in saving it from solitude, I have doomed myself to share its burden of infinite sight." Arwen took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "And sometimes," she replied, "the greatest burdens become the greatest gifts. Tell me, my lord, when you look upon those distant shadows, what do you see?" Aragorn closed his eyes, allowing the strange double vision that had become his constant companion to sharpen and focus. Through his own sight, he saw only the familiar peaks and valleys of the misty mountains, but through the other perception, the one that belonged to the entity they had befriended in the depths, he saw so much more. "I see Gimli," he whispered, wonder touching his voice. "He stands in halls of crystal and mithril, deeper than even Moria dared delve. The lonely mountain has revealed chambers that have waited since the earth's bones were set, and he leads his people in songs of discovery and joy." His vision shifted, carried by the unnamed sight across leagues and years. Legolas sails upon waters that have never known the touch of shadow. He has found islands beyond the gray havens where trees of gold and silver grow, and he tends gardens that bloom with flowers from the elder days. "And Faramir?" Arwen asked softly. "He walks in Ithilien with his son, his eldest son, barely 3 summers old, who carries his grandfather's eyes and his mother's courage. They plant trees together where once only ruins stood, and the child laughs as deer drink from streams that run clear and cold." Aragorn's voice grew thick with emotion. "The unnamed shows me this, not as what might be, but as what shall be. In its sight, hope is not a wish, but a certainty written in the very foundations of the world." Durotan, the Council of Memory. Far to the north, in the halls of Rivendell, Elrond half-elven walked slowly through the Garden of Memory. Each tree, each flower, each carefully tended path held echoes of the long years he had dwelt in this sanctuary. Sooner than the hearts of mortals could comprehend, though still centuries hence, he would depart these shores for the undying lands, and another would tend this garden in his stead. But first, there were debts to be honored and promises to be kept. In the Hall of Fire, a gathering unlike any in the history of Rivendell was taking place. Elladan and Elrohir sat upon chairs carved from the white wood of Númenor, their faces bearing the serene gravity that had marked them since their return from the living Vale. Between them, occupying a place of honor that would have seemed impossible to imagine mere decades before, sat a figure that shifted and shimmered like heat waves over summer stone. The unnamed had learned to take a form that mortal eyes could bear to look upon, tall and slender as the Eldar, with features that suggested both great age and timeless youth. But its eyes remained as they had always been, depths of starless night that held the reflection of infinite possibility. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics, that resonated in frequencies beyond hearing, touching the very souls of those who listen. The children asked difficult questions, it said, a note of something that might have been amusement coloring its words. Yesterday, young Eldarion wished to know why the birds sing differently in the morning than they do at evening. When I showed him the answer, the full answer, with all its branches of causality and consequence, he wept for an hour and would not say why. Elrond leaned forward in his chair, his ageless features creased with concern. You must remember, Ancient One, that mortal minds are not designed to bear the weight of absolute knowledge. What seems like enlightenment to you may appear as crushing despair to them. Yet how else am I to share what I see? The unnamed replied, its form flickering slightly, as emotions it was still learning to name passed through it like clouds across the sun. For 20 years now, I have watched and waited, guardian of possibilities as you ask. But guardianship without sharing feels too much like the old imprisonment, the old solitude that nearly drove me to madness and malice. Elladan spoke then, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked the deep places of the world and returned unchanged. Perhaps the answer lies not in sharing what you see, but in teaching others how to see. The children who come to the living Vale, and yes, they do come now, drawn by dreams and stories, they do not need to bear the full weight of infinite sight, but they can learn to carry a small portion, a single thread in the great tapestry. The unnamed has become a teacher, added Elrohir with a slight smile. Though it knows it not, its very presence in the world has begun to change the nature of wisdom itself. The seers and wise women speak of visions more vivid than any they have known. The minstrels sing songs that seem to carry echoes of the music of creation itself. The entity that had once sought to unmake the world considered these words carefully. In the 20 years since its liberation and transformation, it had learned much about the nature of hope and despair, of burden and gift. But perhaps most importantly, it had learned about the strange alchemy by which suffering could be transformed into compassion and knowledge into wisdom. There is something else, it said finally, its form solidifying as it prepared to share a revelation that had been growing in its consciousness like a seed in fertile ground, something I have seen in the deepest currents of possibility beyond even my previous sight. The hall grew still, save for the crackling of the eternal fire that gave the chamber its name. Even the flames seemed to lean forward, eager to hear what words would come. The music, the unnamed continued, is not finished. What Iluvatar began at the foundation of the world continues still, growing and changing with each choice made by each living being. And I am no longer outside that music. The bonds of friendship you wove about me in the depths have made me a part of it, a new voice in the eternal song. The living Vale, in the heart of the misty mountains, where once the dying Vale had festered like a wound in the world's flesh, something unprecedented in the history of Middle-earth was taking place. The Vale had indeed become living, but not in any way the ancient mapmakers might have imagined. Where once twisted spires had clawed at the cavern ceiling, now trees of crystal and starlight grew in impossible profusion. Their branches bore fruit that tasted of memory and hope, and their leaves whispered with voices that spoke in the pure tongue of creation. The crimson lake had transformed into waters so clear they seemed like liquid air, and in their depths swam creatures of light that had never known the touch of shadow. But perhaps most remarkable of all were the visitors. They came from every corner of Middle-earth, children with eyes full of wonder, elders seeking wisdom for their final years, scholars and artists and dreamers of every description. Some were drawn by stories told around winter fires, others by dreams that came in the deep hours of night. All found their way, somehow, to the hidden paths that led down into the heart of the mountain. Today, as autumn painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, a small group of pilgrims made their way down the winding paths toward the city that was no longer called Thuringwethil, but bore a new name in the common tongue, Ost en Edhil. the city of memory. Among them walked an old woman leaning heavily upon a staff of rowan wood. Her hair was white as fresh snow, but her eyes held the bright intensity of youth. And when she spoke, it was with the accent of distant Rohan. "Tell me again, child," she said to the young man who walked beside her, "how it is that we need not fear this place that once harbored such darkness." The young man, barely 20 summers old, with the keen eyes of a scholar and the strong hands of one raised to useful work, smiled and adjusted the pack upon his shoulder. "Because, grandmother, darkness cannot exist where it is truly understood. The unnamed was not evil by nature, but by isolation. When it was offered friendship and comprehension, its very essence changed. The darkness became light, the discord became harmony." "And you believe this?" the old woman asked, though there was no doubt in her voice, only the testing tone of one who wished to hear wisdom spoken aloud. "I have seen it with my own eyes," the young man replied. "I was among the first children to study in the new hall, to learn from the one who sees all possibilities. It taught me that fear comes from the unknown, and that love is the force that transforms the unknown into the familiar." As they spoke, they rounded a bend in the path and gasped in wonder. Before them stretched a vista that defied every tale they had heard, every description offered by those who had come before. The city of memory rose from the shores of the crystal lake, like a dream made manifest in stone and light. Its spires reached toward the cavern ceiling in graceful curves, their surfaces covered with murals that seemed to move and change as the eye followed them. Gardens cascaded down every level, filled with flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names in any mortal tongue. And throughout it all, moving with purpose and joy, were the inhabitants of this impossible place. They were not many in number, perhaps a few hundred souls in all, but they represented every race and nation of Middle-earth. Elves worked alongside men, dwarves shared their craft secrets with hobbit children, and overall, presided the gentle presence of the unnamed, no longer terrible to behold, but beautiful in a way that brought tears of joy to those who looked upon it. "Welcome, traveler," came a voice like distant music, and the unnamed materialized beside the path as if it had always been there. To the old woman, it appeared as a figure of maternal comfort, wreathed in robes that seemed to hold the warmth of every hearth she had ever known. To the young man, it showed itself as a teacher and guide, bearing scrolls and books that contained all the wisdom of ages. "We have prepared chambers for your rest," the entity continued, "and tomorrow, if you wish, we shall begin your lessons. But first, there is something you must see, something that will help you understand why this place exists, and why you have been drawn here." It led them through streets that sang with half-remembered melodies, past fountains that wept tears of liquid starlight, until they reached the heart of the city. Here stood a simple building of white stone, unmarked by any sign or symbol, its doors standing always open to welcome all who would enter. "The Hall of Echoes," the unnamed explained as they stepped across the threshold. "Here, we preserve not just the memories of what was, but the dreams of what might yet be. Every soul who visits the living Vale leaves something of themselves here, a hope, a fear, a moment of perfect understanding, and from these fragments, we weave new possibilities for the world above." The hall was vast beyond measure, its walls lined with alcoves that stretched up into misty heights. In each alcove rested a crystal sphere, no larger than a child's fist, that pulsed with gentle light. There were thousands upon thousands of them, each one containing the essence of a memory or dream. "Touch one," the unnamed invited, "and see what futures your choices might bring." The old woman reached out with trembling fingers to caress the nearest sphere. Light flowed from it like water, and suddenly she was seeing, not with her eyes, but with her heart, visions of Rohan as it might become. She saw her granddaughter leading the riders in a charge not against orcs or wolves, but against ignorance and despair. She witnessed the great horse lords transformed into healers and teachers, their strength turned to the nurture of growing things rather than the waging of war. "It is possible," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. All of it is possible. More than possible, the unnamed replied gently. Certain, if the choices are made with wisdom and love. This is what I have learned in my years of watching and waiting, that the future is not fixed, but neither is it chaos. It responds to the touch of compassionate will, as a harp responds to a skilled musician's hand. The song continued. As the seasons turned and years passed like leaves falling from an ancient tree, the influence of the living Vale spread throughout Middle-earth in ways both subtle and profound. The dreams that touched sleepers in Gondor and Rohan, in the Shire, and the Grey Havens carried with them fragments of the vast harmony that the unnamed had learned to perceive. Artists found themselves creating works of unprecedented beauty, as if their hands were guided by some beneficent force beyond their understanding. Scholars discovered connections between diverse fields of knowledge that had never been apparent before. Children played games that seemed to contain echoes of the music of creation itself, their laughter ringing with harmonics that brought tears of joy to their parents' eyes. And in the deep places of the world, in caverns and valleys that had never known the light of sun or star, ancient evils felt the touch of transformation and began, slowly and tentatively, to remember what they had been before shadow claimed them. The Balrog that slumbered in the depths beneath Moria stirred in its dreams and found, to its amazement, memories of the time before its fall, when it had been a being of flame and light, a servant of Olli the smith, dedicated to the crafting of beautiful things. The change was imperceptible at first, a softening of the endless rage that had sustained it through millennia of darkness. But like a single candle lit in a vast darkness, that tiny spark of reclaimed identity began to grow. In the far south, where the mouth of Sauron had once held court in the shadow of Mount Doom, travelers reported strange encounters with a figure cloaked in gray, who would appear at crossroads and offer guidance to those who had lost their way. It spoke with the voice of one who had known great evil and greater redemption, and its words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "The road is long," it would say to those who paused to listen, "but no road is so long that it cannot be traveled one step at a time, and no darkness is so deep that it cannot be illuminated by a single candle, if that candle is lit with love rather than hatred." These changes did not come without resistance. There were those who preferred the old certainties of absolute good and absolute evil, who found comfort in the simplicity of eternal division between light and shadow. Some raised armies and built fortresses against the creeping influence of what they called the soft heresy. Others simply closed their hearts and minds, refusing to acknowledge the evidence of transformation that surrounded them on every side. But for each voice raised in opposition, 10 others joined the growing chorus of understanding. The children, especially, seemed naturally attuned to the new harmonies that were reshaping the world. They sang songs that their parents had never taught them, played games that revealed deep truths about the nature of existence, and asked questions that pierced straight to the heart of the most complex philosophical problem. In the Shire, the Took children began organizing what they called Story Circle, where they would gather to share tales not just of adventure and heroism, but of redemption and transformation. The Baggins family started a tradition of kindness feasts, where the table was always set for one more guest than expected, in case a stranger in need should happen by. In Rohan, the horse lords found their mounts responding to commands that had never been spoken aloud, as if the bond between rider and steed had deepened into something approaching true telepathy. The horses themselves seemed calmer, more intelligent, and on quiet evenings they could be heard making sounds that were almost like singing. Even in distant Erebor, King Dain reported that his miners were discovering chambers filled with crystals that sang when touched, and that the very mountain seemed more willing to yield up its treasures, as if the stone itself had developed a sense of cooperation rather than mere endurance. The final revelation, on a day when the sun shone bright and clear over Middle-earth, when the wind carried the scent of new growth and the promise of spring, Aragorn stood once more upon the battlements of Minas Tirith. But he was not alone. Beside him stood his son, Eldarion. Now 15 years old and bearing the mixed heritage of his bloodline, in every line of his face. The nobility of Numenor, the wisdom of Rivendell, and something new besides, a depth of perception that belonged to the changing age. "Father," the young prince said, his voice carrying the careful tone of one who speaks of profound matters, "last night I dreamed of a music that filled all the world, and in that music I heard voices I did not recognize, singing in harmony with all the familiar songs." Aragorn nodded slowly. Through his bond with the unnamed, he too had perceived the change that his son described. The music of creation, which had seemed complete at the making of the world, was still growing, still evolving, still adding new voices to its eternal chorus. "What did you see, my son?" he asked gently. Eldarion closed his eyes, the better to remember the vast vision that had filled his dreams. "I saw the world as it might become, not in 100 years or 1,000, but in ages yet unborn. I saw beings that do not yet exist, walking in lands that have not yet been shaped, singing songs that have not yet been written, and all of them were part of the same great music." "And what did you learn from this vision?" "That nothing is ever truly finished," the prince replied, opening his eyes to meet his father's gaze. "That every ending is also a beginning, every death a birth, every note of despair transformed into hope, if only we have the patience to hear the full song." As father and son stood together in the morning light, watching the sun paint the peaks of the distant mountains in shades of gold and rose, they felt a presence beside them that was both familiar and strange. The unnamed had learned to project itself across vast distances, to be present wherever it was needed or welcome. "The time approaches," it said, its voice like wind through crystal chimes, "when I must choose what form my service will take in the ages to come. For 20 years I have watched and waited, taught and learned, but the world changes, and I must change with it." "What do you see in the paths ahead?" Aragorn asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "I see a choice," the unnamed replied, "between remaining as I am, guardian and teacher, bound to the living Vale and its immediate influence, or taking a different path entirely. I could surrender my individual existence, allow myself to be dissolved into the greater music itself, becoming not a voice in the chorus, but part of the harmony that underlies all voices." Eldarion drew in a sharp breath. "That would mean death, would it not?" "Death and birth," the unnamed agreed. "The ending of what I am now, and the beginning of something far greater. If I choose this path, I will cease to exist as a separate entity, but my essence will become woven into the very fabric of reality itself. Every act of compassion, every moment of understanding, every choice made from love rather than fear would carry within it a fragment of what I have learned." Aragorn felt tears gathering in his eyes, though whether they were born of sorrow or joy, he could not say. "And if you choose this path, the bond between us would end," the unnamed finished gently. "You would no longer carry the burden of infinite sight, but neither would you have its gifts. You would return to being fully and only human, with all the limitations and freedoms that entails." For long moments they stood in silence, contemplating the magnitude of such a choice. Finally, Eldarion spoke, his young voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "What does your heart counsel?" he asked simply. The unnamed's form shimmered, and for a moment it seemed to become transparent, as if it were already beginning to fade into the greater harmony it described. When it spoke again, its voice was filled with a peace that was almost tangible. "My heart," it said wonderingly, "counsels trust. Trust in the music that has guided all things from the beginning. Trust in the wisdom of surrender, when surrender serves a purpose greater than individual existence. Trust in the love that has transformed me from destroyer to guardian, and might yet transform me from guardian to something even more wonderful." The great transformation, the choice, when it came, was made not in the depths of the living Vale or in the halls of kings, but in a simple garden where children played and flowers bloomed in the quiet heart of an ordinary day. A little girl, no more than 7 summers old, had scraped her knee while running through the meadows near her home. As she sat weeping by a stream, confused by the pain and wondering why such hurts existed in the world, she felt a gentle presence beside her. The unnamed appeared to her as any child might imagine a comforting spirit, warm and soft and glowing with gentle light. It knelt beside her and placed what seemed like a hand upon her small head. "Why do things have to hurt?" she asked through her tears. "So that healing can exist," the entity replied, its voice like her mother's lullaby and her father's bedtime stories combined. "So that comfort can have meaning, and so that when pain ends, the joy is all the sweeter." Kate, but wouldn't it be better if nothing hurt at all? The unnamed considered this question with all the vast weight of its accumulated wisdom, and found in it the perfect clarity it had been seeking. "Perhaps," it said finally, "but then there would be no courage, for courage only exists in the face of fear. There would be no compassion, for compassion is born from understanding suffering. There would be no growth, for growth comes from overcoming challenges. The hurt you feel now will heal, little one, but the memory of healing will make you kinder to others who hurt." As it spoke these words, the unnamed felt something within itself shift and settle, like tumblers falling into place in an ancient lock. This was its answer. This was its choice. Not the grand gesture of dissolution into cosmic harmony, but the simple commitment to remain present for every scraped knee and broken heart, every moment of confusion and every spark of understanding. But even as it made this choice, the entity felt the music of creation respond with a harmony so perfect and profound that it seemed to rewrite the very nature of existence itself. The choice to remain and serve was itself a form of surrender, and that surrender opened pathways of possibility that had never existed before. The little girl's tears stopped, and her scraped knee healed without so much as a scar. But more than that, she rose from beside the stream with knowledge she had not possessed moments before. Not the heavy burden of absolute wisdom, but the light, sustaining gift of intuitive understanding. She would grow up to become a healer, not because of any formal training, but because she had learned in that moment by the stream that pain and healing were both parts of a greater wholeness. And across Middle-earth, in that same instant, countless others felt a similar touch of understanding. The Balrog, in the depths of Moria, woke fully and completely from its ancient rage, remembering at last its true name and nature. The former mouth of Sauron removed his gray cloak for the final time, revealing features that had been transformed by service and sacrifice into something approaching divine beauty. The crystals in Erebor began to sing in harmonies that reached through stone and earth to touch the hearts of all who dwelt above. But perhaps, most importantly, in the simple homes and halls where ordinary people lived ordinary lives, children began to dream dreams that would reshape the world, not through conquest or grand gesture, but through the accumulated weight of countless small acts of kindness, understanding, and love. The unnamed had learned, in that moment by the stream, the final lesson that had been prepared for it since the beginning of time. True transcendence came not from rising above the world, but from embracing it so completely that the distinction between self and other, between individual and universal, simply ceased to matter. It would remain as guardian and teacher, but it would also become something more, a living embodiment of the principle that love, once truly understood and fully embraced, has the power to transform not just individuals, but the very nature of reality itself. And so the music continued, richer and more complex than ever before, with new voices joining the eternal song each day. The echoes in the living vale resonated with harmonies that had never been heard before, carrying forward into ages yet unborn the promise that no darkness is ever truly permanent, no evil ever truly absolute, and no ending ever truly final. The song Eternal played on, and all of Middle-earth danced to its rhythm, whether they knew it or not.